Welcome to This Explainer. We're diving right into the fascinating and honestly kind of hidden story about who actually pays for science. And to really get a grip on who pays for the future, we have to start way back in January 1610. Imagine a 45-year-old physics professor looking through a homemade telescope and spotting four tiny dots blinking into existence around Jupiter. He had just discovered the first moons ever found around another planet. But what he did next is the real story. So why exactly did Galileo rename Jupiter's moons? Well, his very first move wasn't to publish this massive discovery for the noble glory of human knowledge. Nope, it was a highly calculated career move. He immediately named those newly discovered moons the Medicean stars, after his boss's family, Cosimo de' Medici. Why? Simply put, he was hunting for a better job. And this brilliantly illustrates a fundamental truth we usually just ignore. You know, we love to tell the story of science as this pure, noble march toward truth, driven entirely by curiosity. But the reality? Galileo's strategic naming got him exactly what he wanted: a fat pay raise, a fancy new title, and absolutely zero teaching duties. It turns out science needs money before anyone knows if an idea will actually work. Galileo's brilliant careerist job hunt is, for sure, the blueprint for all scientific progress we're going to look at today. If we track this transaction across 400 years of history, from Galileo's patrons in 1610 to the clubs of the 1660s, to Edison's industrial labs in 1876, all the way up to massive government funding in 1950, we see the exact same strategy at play. In every single era, we have to ask, who actually has the money and what are they buying? Section 1, the patronage racket: islands, elks, and egos. To really see this in action, let's rewind a bit to 1576. Danish King Frederick II handed a 29-year-old astronomer named Tycho Brahe an entire island called Heaven. He literally gave him the island, its villagers, who by the way had to build his house for free, and a pet elk that supposedly died after getting drunk and fallen down the stairs. I mean, you absolutely cannot make this stuff up. The sheer scale of this funding is just staggering. Tycho's observatory, which was this crazy mix of part castle, part alchemy lab, ate up 1% to 2% of Denmark's entire national budget every single year for 20 years. Just imagine a modern government handing a NASA-sized slice of their budget to one guy just to look at the stars. And the king did it for one reason: to make Denmark, and himself, famous throughout Europe. But here is what that massive royal ego trip actually bought us. Tycho's incredibly precise data, which he gathered over decades, was eventually used by his assistant, a brilliant mathematician named Johannes Kepler. Kepler took that data and worked out the planetary laws of motion. That means modern orbital mechanics, the literal math that gets our satellites into space right now, traces directly back to a Danish king's desire for prestige. It's the Galileo strategy all over again, right? Trading prestige for the resources to do the science. Section 2. Prizes, clubs, and rich friends. When the patron model shifted, relying on one rich guy's mood eventually started to seem like a really bad idea. So in the 1660s, scientists started forming clubs, like London's Royal Society. It sounds incredibly prestigious, but they had absolutely zero government money. They relied entirely on weekly dues of 1 shilling from their members, and surviving records show them constantly chasing down these elite members who just wouldn't pay their bills. Meanwhile, governments figured out a totally new model: the prize. To solve these horrific navigation disasters, the British Parliament offered a massive £20,000 prize in 1714 for anyone who could calculate longitude at sea. But when a self-taught clockmaker named John Harrison actually solved it with a ridiculously precise mechanical clock, the elite astronomers on the board completely stalled his payment for over 30 years. They just couldn't believe a carpenter's son beat them to it, so he had to fight the very institution funding him just to get paid. Another fascinating model emerged around the same time. Wealthy friends formed the Lunar Society in Birmingham. Their strategy was pretty simple. Step 1, meet around the full moon so you can actually see the road home. Step 2, drink wine. Step 3, fund each other's research out of pocket. It was basically an 18th century angel investor syndicate. In fact, Josiah Wedgwood's pottery fortune from this exact group ultimately funded his grandson Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin never needed a day job, all thanks to Chinaware money. But we can't ignore that private funding had some very real and very dark risks. Take the brilliant French chemist Antoine Lavoisier. He basically invented modern chemistry, and his day job funded his incredibly well-equipped lab. The problem? Well, his day job was as a tax collector for a deeply despised private tax syndicate. During the French Revolution, the exact same funding source that built his lab put him on a list of enemies, and he was guillotined. So yeah, sometimes the money and the risk were the exact same thing. Section 3. The Invention Factory. Patents, Monopolies, and Legacies. Fast forward to the 1870s, and industry takes the reins. Thomas Edison built what he called an invention factory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. And he operated on a literal, stated quota. He demanded one minor invention every 10 days, and a major one every 6 months. Talk about pressure. This era perfectly highlights the big industrial trade-offs. You had J.P. Morgan bankrolling Edison for a cut of the patents, which eventually created General Electric. Over in Sweden, Alfred Nobel, who made an absolute fortune inventing dynamite, used his explosive profits to fix his legacy after a mistaken obituary called him a merchant of death. Just like Galileo securing a good name, Nobel bought himself a permanent positive legacy, the Nobel Prize. And then you have AT&T's legally protected telephone monopoly, which generated guaranteed profits that funded Bell Labs, giving researchers the sheer freedom to invent the transistor, literally the building block of all modern electronics. Section 4. The Government Blank Check. Bending the Timeline of Technology. This brings us to the moment government funding stopped being just one of many options and briefly became the biggest R&D operation on the entire planet. World War II changed absolutely everything. The Manhattan Project employed around 130,000 people at its peak and cost roughly $2 billion 1940s dollars, which is about $30 billion today. It proved to every government on Earth that throwing massive amounts of money and thousands of scientists at a super hard problem drastically bends the timeline of human technology. That massive success directly inspired the 1950 creation of the National Science Foundation, where governments officially started funding pure curiosity at scale, on purpose. And then came the panic. October 1957. The Soviet Union launches Sputnik, and the United States goes into a full-blown national meltdown. A beach ball-sized satellite that did literally nothing but beep caused an extreme Cold War panic. But, funny enough, that panic accidentally funded the modern world. Look at the sheer explosion of funding that followed. NASA's budget ballooned so insanely fast that by 1966, just to beat the Soviets to the moon, they were eating up 4.4% of the entire U.S. federal budget. To put that in perspective for you, today NASA gets about 1/3 of 1%. It was a totally different world. That exact same Cold War panic also birthed a tiny Pentagon office called ARPA. Their goal was highly specific. Figure out how to survive a nuclear strike by building a communications network with no single point of failure. But their legacy? Well, they accidentally built the basic architecture of the modern internet, the very network you are using to stream this explainer right now. Section 5. The Great Unbundling. What happens when guaranteed money disappears? Eventually, the era of guaranteed money science starts, well, running out of guaranteed money. By the 1980s, the big monopolies were breaking up. AT&T lost its massive cushion. Meanwhile, corporate labs like Xerox PARC were doing incredible things. They basically invented the graphical user interface and the computer mouse. But Xerox didn't turn them into products. A young company called Apple took a tour, looked closely, and commercialized the whole thing. Xerox photocopiers literally paid for the future of personal computing, and then just handed that future to Apple for free. The cushion for endless corporate basic research was rapidly deflating. And, history has a funny way of looping right back on itself. Back in 1660, the Royal Society relied on elite members paying slow weekly dues in person. Jump to April 2020, during the pandemic, and tech billionaires created fast grants to fund COVID research. It was basically a high-tech Royal Society. 48-hour decisions, rapid wire transfers, and completely private high-speed funding stepping in when traditional government grants were just moving way too slowly. And today, we're seeing a huge reaction across the board. In 2023, the UK launched an agency called ARIA with £800 million, explicitly copying the old DARPA playbook of small teams taking on high risk. Meanwhile, the two biggest US funders, the NIH and the NSF, are locked in these historic, drawn-out budget fights. Thousands of grants are paused while politicians debate the final numbers. Honestly, it looks exactly like Tycho Brahe arguing with the Danish royal treasury 400 years ago, just with better lawyers. So the absolutely crucial point we need to take away from all this is what I like to call the Galileo strategy. Remember why Galileo renamed Jupiter's moons right at the start? Because the reality is scientific discovery is rarely funded purely for its own sake. It is intrinsically linked to the specific agendas of whoever holds the purse strings. From Galileo's job hunt, to a king's ego, to the Cold War panic that built the internet, Scientific curiosity is incredibly real, but absolutely no breakthrough happens without a backer's agenda actually paying the bills. Whoever is writing the checks today, whether it's squeeze governments, huge corporations, or tech billionaires, will ultimately decide what gets discovered tomorrow. Their agendas are mapping our future right now. So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If you had the unlimited cash to pull a Galileo, to buy your way into the history books and get a moon named after yourself, what field of science would you fund? Thanks for exploring this explainer with me, and stay curious.